Last time, I survived 200 days with the Create mod in Hardcore Minecraft, and based off the comments, yet again, it seems like you all really wanted to see even more. So this time, I survived 300 days with the Create mod in Hardcore Minecraft. And as always, remember to like and subscribe if you guys enjoy the video. I spent majority of the day mining because not only did I want this storage room to solve my massive hoarding issue, but I also wanted it to use a super cool create-based sorting system, which meant I was going to need some serious room to work with. Remember, I said super cool and not super efficient, and that's going to be a pretty important distinction to remember later on. By the end of the day, I had carved out a pretty nice hole in the wall. Day 202 started out with me crafting up some of the basic blocks I would need for my storage system. This was pretty much just a bunch of chests and then different styles of deep slate and andesite blocks because you all suggested I give the cave a bit more variation, and so that's exactly what I was planning on doing. Once I had all the blocks ready to go, I carved out some small alcoves in the storage area and placed down 8 double chests in each. In the end, I had 5 alcoves and would eventually have 40 double chests, which I figured would at least be a pretty good starting off point. With the general layout of the storage room set up, I spent day 203 trying to make the area look at least a little bit more presentable. I replaced the blocks between each alcove with polished deep slate and made some deep slate columns between each set of chests just to give the walls some more depth and texture. I replaced the floor of each alcove with polished andesite to avoid using black for the entire room, and even placed some moss blocks in the corner of the room just to add a little bit of color. To finish off the day, I replaced the ceiling of each alcove with polished andesite blocks to match the flooring, but didn't fill in the blocks over each chest because I was planning to put stairs there later anyway. Not to sound too much like Crunk from The Emperor's New Groove, but oh yeah, it was all coming together. I started out day 204 by making a few more variations of deep slate using the stone cutter. I placed down deep slate stairs over each of the upper chests so they could still open, and then replaced the blocks lining the outside of the alcoves with deep slate tiles. Since I was putting so much effort into making this room look nice, I didn't just want to use torches to light it up, so I got some lanterns and placed them down on the deep slate bricks in front of each column. I'm not saying this video should be featured on HGTV, but if it was, I'm pretty sure it would be a hit. Once I had the lighting situation dealt with, I duplicated what I had done on the floor and replaced the blocks lining the outside of the alcoves with deep slate tiles. I finished off the day by clearing out the rest of the floor, replacing it with cobbled deep slate, and then working in some patches of moss because, as we all know, I can't get enough of the deep slate and moss combo. On day 205, it was time to deal with the ceiling, since it was the last ugly part of the room. I cleared out the entire ceiling and replaced it all with cobbled deep slate, just like I had done with the floor. Once I was done, I noticed the ceiling wasn't really blending too well with the cave outside, so I spent some time building it out to look at least a little bit more natural and gradual. I finished off the ceiling by putting in some patches of moss blocks to yet again break up the sea of black blocks that it was turning into, but I was running low on moss, so I only ended up putting in like 2 really tiny patches. Once the bulk of the room design was done, it was time to add the most critical element of any storage room, which is clearly the item frames. I went and crafted as many item frames as I could and placed them down on each chest. To quite literally nobody's surprise, I didn't have enough, so the rest of the frames would have to wait until more cows met their unfortunate fate at my hands. Oh yeah, and for those of you freaking out about me missing a lantern on day 204, don't worry, at the end of the day, I ended up fixing that. Day 206 was a crafting day, as the next stage of the storage room was going to be the automated sorting setup using Create. I spent the entire day crafting 5 mechanical arms, 1 for each alcove. This meant making 5 precision mechanisms, which thankfully was at least a little bit easier due to the automated setup from last video. Along with this, I made a lot of brass and andesite alloy for both the mechanical arms and the brass funnels that I would need. While the mechanical arms took the longest to make, the 40 brass funnels I had to make definitely were the most expensive. It would all be worth it in the end though, right? With majority of the crafting out of the way, I started out day 207 by clearing out the area behind each alcove where the main belt system would run that would carry items from around the base to be sorted and stored. I got pretty lucky and even found some diamonds while I was clearing it out. Apparently, I can't find any diamonds when I actually mine for them, but I can find plenty when I don't want them or even need them. Once the area for the belt was cleared out, I went around and placed down a brass funnel on the back of each chest so items could eventually be filtered and put in each one. I then went and placed down the belts and replaced the blocks around them with cobbled deep slate, since this would still at least be partially visible, and I was set on this room being pretty much perfect. On day 208, I wanted to finish the vanilla building of the storage room, so I crafted up more deep slate tiles and placed those as the back wall in each alcove behind the belt system. With this, the room design was pretty much finally done, so I went around and placed down the mechanical arms hanging from the ceiling in each alcove above the belt system just to see how it would look. I absolutely loved how it turned out, but there was still a lot of work left to do before it actually functioned properly, so I cleared up my inventory, grabbed some wheat from the wheat farm, and took the elevator to the surface to go find some cows for more leather and sheep for wool. Thankfully, the Minimap mod allowed me to pretty easily find some sheep rather than having to wander around aimlessly for days like before. I slowly led the first one I found over to the other two that were nearby. Unfortunately, if you're a keen observer, you might notice the mistake that I was about to make. I had the wheat in my offhand, and when I sheared the sheep, I fed them the wheat at the same time, and before I realized it, I had no wheat left. So I had essentially traded my will to live for a stupid baby sheep. After making a quick trip back to the base to get more wheat and some fencing to hold the sheep once I got them home, I made the trek back over to the now group of 3 adult sheep and one horrible mistake on day 209. It definitely took a bit of time to get them back to the base, as these sheep did not want to cooperate with me. Maybe they knew I killed their brethren in a prior video, maybe they didn't, there's no way to know for sure, but as the sun was setting, we finally arrived at the elevator. I quickly set up a small pen using the fencing I made and lured the sheep into it. Day 210 ended up being a pretty laid-back farming day. I spent the start of the day just sitting at the wheat farm waiting for a few pieces to grow so I could use it to breed the sheep. It was a bit boring since I was quite literally just watching wheat grow, but it would be worth it in the end since I would have sheep to shear, and you all could stop commenting about how I needed to get some sheep so I could shear them. Once I had 6 pieces of wheat, I figured it was enough and took the elevator back up and spent the rest of the day breeding and shearing the sheep until I had at least 35 wool, since I was going to need at least another 35 item filters. Now that I had all the wool I would need to make the filters for each brass funnel, I spent days 211 all the way till 213 setting up as many different filters for the chests as I could possibly think of. Majority of this involved me just running around the base trying to even remember everything I had automated the production of, because more than 95% of what would eventually go into this storage room would come from all those farms and generators. In the end, I managed to set filters for over 50% of the chests, but I would have to come back later on to finish the rest once I knew what items were actually overlooked. To finish off the day, I set up a final overflow chest at the very end of the last belt. The overflow chest really wouldn't come in handy at all until I had filters set for every chest in the room, but I figured it was better to set it up now rather than forget and have items despawn, because that's definitely a me thing to do. With the construction of the new room now complete, I spent day 214 starting to work on the functional aspects. I cleared out a small area right in front of the overflow chest and placed down some water wheels with soul sand to eventually power the mechanical arms and the belts. It took a bit of blending to make the area look natural, but in the end I was sufficiently happy with how it turned out. Once I had the rotational power generation ready to go, I went and crafted a bunch of different blocks to transfer that power, like cogwheels and gearboxes. I then cleared out the area above each mechanical arm and ran shafts and gearboxes through it to connect the cogwheels that would power each mechanical arm. Thankfully, the direction of rotation doesn't matter for mechanical arms, so I got to be a little bit lazy here, which is never a bad thing. Unfortunately, the rotational speed does matter for mechanical arms and is actually quite critical. So I spent the start of day 215 gearing up the 20 RPM power from the water wheels to 80 RPM, and then connected that to the shaft system running to each mechanical arm. Now that each mechanical arm actually had sufficient power going to it, it was time to set the inputs and outputs. So one by one, I popped off each mechanical arm, set its inputs to the belt below it, set its outputs to the 8 brass funnels in each respective alcove, and then tossed them back down. And with that, the last thing left to do was actually to bring items into the room on the belt system, so I cleared out the area at the start of the first belt to run another belt down below all the automated setups in the base and collect the items there. Before I started making the extremely messy belt system that would run under the entire base, I marked where each item output would need to be connected by placing down waypoints on the minimap. I spent day 216 pretending to be a mole and really just sat underground digging tunnels from the belt system to each of the different waypoints that I had just marked on the map. It definitely became a bit of a maze by the time I finished, but I hoped that because it was mostly underground, it wouldn't bother me too much that it was disgustingly inefficient. I know some of you love these spaghetti belt systems, but I definitely do not. Day 217 was spent placing down belts in the tunnel system that I had just made to eventually carry all the items back to the storage room. Majority of this was super easy, but I did run into some trouble when trying to get around the shafts and gearboxes that were bringing power from the vertical windmills over to the kelp farm. I also had to make sure each belt would properly eject items from it to the next one when it was going around corners. With all the belts now placed down, I started out day 218 by placing down a water wheel underground to power the belts. In the newer Create updates, the belts no longer require stress capacity, so I only really needed one water wheel. I also technically could have hooked it up to the mechanical arm rotational power, but then it would be moving at 80 RPM, which would be too fast. I spent the rest of day 218 and majority of day 219 transferring the rotational power from each belt to the next one, which required a fair bit of gearboxes to get everything actually moving in the correct direction. Once all the belts were properly running, I placed down chutes from each of the item outputs. It was really important I ran the chutes all the way down to the belt, because then items would only drop onto the belt if there was room for them, rather than just kind of spewing out everywhere and eventually despawning. On day 220, I started out by removing all the depot outputs from the ore processing, since I would no longer have items actually sitting in the item vaults. I decided to keep the item vaults themselves and all the different output chests from all the farms and generators, because even though they didn't really serve much of a purpose anymore, I wanted to preserve how the base looked, and I was also super lazy and it would require reworking pretty much every setup. I made sure to double check that all the output chests were emptying, since there were a lot of items flooding the belt system right now, causing a bit of a backup, but it seemed everything was working fine, so thankfully I didn't have to go back underground to try to troubleshoot. I finished off the day by sitting back and watching the new storage and sorting system work after 20 days of both hard and at times very tedious work. Day 221 marked the start of my next project, which was to set up an XP farm using a mob spawner, so I set out on the journey to wander around nearby caves until I just came across one. I was planning on getting mending on all my tools, so I would then need some form of XP farm, and because I was too lazy to light up all the caves around me, I decided hauling mob spawners back to the base using Create cart contraptions would probably be easier than trying to get good rates using a dark room. By the end of the day, I mined a fair bit of ore while exploring caves, but I hadn't found any mob spawners and was questioning if this was just overall a bad decision. Thankfully, on day 222, I could see a bunch of mobs on the minimap, mined towards them, and stumbled across a mob spawner, and I was so happy this wasn't going to be horrible video content. Or at least that was the case until I saw the type of spawner. It was a spider spawner, because of course it had to be a spider spawner, the one type of spawner I couldn't use for this farm. I looted the chests and decided to go through the rest of the cave and at least mine the ore before leaving. In one of the best strokes of luck I've had in this entire world, at the very end of that small cave, there was another mob spawner. And on top of that, to make it even better, this one was a zombie spawner, which was perfect, or so I thought at least. Future Rage would kinda hate past Rage for forgetting about baby zombies, but that's for another day. Now that I had located a spawner to move to the base, I mined a long tunnel straight back and dumped all the ores that I had mined on the trip into the ore processing setup. Day 223 was preparation day for bringing the mob spawner back to the base. I wandered around the base for a little bit trying to decide where I would put the spawner, since it was going to need a fair bit of room, and eventually I settled on the open area directly next to the elevator. This area was pretty messy, so I cleared some of it out and started filling in majority of it with cobbled deep slate so I would have a nice little foundation to build on. I had to make a quick trip over to the minecart unloading area for more deep slate because of just how much this was using, but thankfully I had saved multiple chests worth during the last video and was able to get plenty to finish filling in the area. With the space outside ready to go, it was now time for me to clear out the actual spawning area. So on day 224, I mined into the wall opposite the elevator and cleared out a 9x9 room that I would eventually move the spawner into. Once the room was cleared out, I finished it off by placing a bunch of belts down that would carry the mobs to the collection point. Was this more expensive than water? Yes. Was this less efficient than water? Possibly. Was this cooler than water? Absolutely. Now that I knew where my collection point was going to be, I spent day 225 making the outside of the spawning area actually look kind of nice. I surrounded the collection point with polished andesite, and then surrounded that with deep slate tiles and 2 columns on either side just to add some depth and texture. I then put polished deep slate around that, and finally put in some lanterns and polished deep slate slabs just to add some detail. I finished off the day by blending in the walls around the area, using some andesite here, some cobbled deep slate there, so in the end it all looked a little bit more natural, and most of all it had significantly less clay. I really hate clay if you couldn't tell. On day 226, I started out by setting up a chest and some hoppers right at the mob collection point to pick up all the drops, even though like 99% of them or more would be totally useless coming from zombies. Once I was ready to go, I spent the rest of the day setting up 2 water wheels to power all the belts inside. Only one of these water wheels was actually needed to power the belts, but for the sake of symmetry, I just put one on each side. With the rotational power ready to go, I started hooking up the belts inside the spawning area, and while they definitely fought me a bit to get the proper direction of rotation, I eventually got it all working properly. Day 227 was spent doing the extremely boring task of running the rails all the way from the spot I wanted the spawner to be placed inside the spawning room to the actual spawner that needed to be moved. Sadly, I didn't think about what would happen once the carded spawner actually made it into the spawning room very well, and that would eventually cause some problems for me in a little bit. Once I had the rails complete, I loaded the spawner onto a furnace minecart using the cart assembler, fueled it up, and had it go all the way back to the base. And for those of you that are wondering, it is now no longer an option to actually pick up the cart contraption with a spawner on it by default. So short of changing the config file, which you can in fact do, I now have to go about it in this slightly more painful method. Day 228 started out as an absolute nightmare when I realized the cart would be placing the spawner down 1 block higher than I wanted. So I tried to drop the cart down by 1 block and place it there, but somehow managed to shoot the cart off the block and onto the belt system. I then had to spend half the day trying to make a convoluted system of rails to get it back where I actually wanted it. Once the spawner was successfully placed down, I cleaned up the mess that I had just made of the spawning room, closed it off, collected all the rails that I had placed down to the spawner, and called it a day. With the setup mostly done, day 229 was used to troubleshoot it, and thank God I did. I sat for a while to see what the rates were like, and quite honestly, they were terrible. Thankfully, this could be fixed really easily by just getting more spawners and bringing them over, but that would need to be for another day because I wasn't doing that process over again. The one thing that was an immediate problem was the fact the spawner could spawn in baby zombies, which would just pour right out of the collection point into my base and attack me. I quickly fixed this by adjusting where the slabs were, and I also just put down some iron bars, which actually look kind of cool. I also added a stockpile switch to the collection chest so a chute would drop some of the useless items into lava if the chest ever got too full of disgusting zombie meat or useless 2% durability armor or, whatever they drop. Unfortunately, I then found out my earlier fix to the baby zombies also made it so I couldn't collect XP and totally defeated the purpose, so I moved the slabs back 1 block on top of the hoppers, and finally the setup was done. On day 230, I sat and waited for mobs to spawn to again test the rates and get a bit of XP, but it was so slow I was just forced to get a sign and accurately named the mob spawner to shame myself. Once I got more spawners in it, I could take the sign down, but until then, I was bringing shame upon my family, myself, and even my cow. Now that I had an XP farm, no matter how bad it might be, I also needed some mending books, which meant day 231 started the process of me getting a villager with the mending trade. I crafted up a bunch of stuff before heading out, so I could make use of a cart contraption to transport the villager a bit easier if the village ended up being hundreds of blocks away. I took the elevator to the surface and set out on my journey to find a village. Thankfully, I actually got pretty lucky and stumbled across a village only a few hundred blocks away from the base that would have plenty of villagers to work with. On day 232, I cleared out an area at the edge of the village and started assembling my cart contraption that would bring the villagers back to the base. Similar to the tunnel bore, I placed down linear chassis over the cart assembler to hold it all together, and then placed down a plow in the back to pick up the rails the cart contraption already went over. I then built up the front and placed down a deployer to place rails, a deployer to place blocks in front of the rails in case there was air there, and then finally drills at the front that would clear anything in its path. I slapped a chest down on top of everything to hold the building blocks and rails, trapped a villager in a minecart, chained it to the furnace minecart the contraption would be on, and realized I forgot fuel. Day 233 started out with me fixing my mistake of forgetting fuel for the 100th time by tearing down the villagers' houses and using the material to make a furnace and then some charcoal. Once I had enough charcoal, I picked everything back up, fueled up the furnace minecart, and off it went. I hopped on the seat I put on the back and enjoyed the ride. At least until the minecart stopped because it hit a leaf block which apparently can't have rails placed on it. Good thing I wasn't traveling through a really dense forest. The next 3 days were pretty much just awful as I had to spend them getting this stupid villager back home, and every 5 blocks my cart contraption would break because of a leaf block. Imagine that, right? An engineer and his feat of innovation knocked down in his prime because of a stupid leaf block. Eventually, on day 236, I got the villager back to the base, shoved him in the elevator, and took him down to their new home. Now that I had the villager down at my base, I became acutely aware of how easy it would be for them to die, so I trapped them in a boat while I cleared out a little area between the iron generator and the storage room to stick them in. It took way more fiddling than I would like to admit before I managed to get the villager in the hole, but eventually I had them trapped. I crafted up a lectern, placed it down in front of them, and nothing happened. I then let them out and chased them around with the lectern like some deranged murderer in a horror movie, and still nothing if you can imagine. Eventually, I gave up and figured they were either trying to path to a random workstation somewhere or a bed somewhere, and I was never going to get them to work. Having given up on the worthless piece of crap that was now residing in my base, I went back to the surface on day 238 to get more villagers. Since the prior cart experience left a lot to be desired, I manually placed down the rails this time, leading all the way back to the village from the base. Luckily for me, it was a cleared path from the initial trip back, but it still took until the end of day 239 to make it to the village, since maybe I didn't have enough rails and maybe I had to go back to the base at some point to get more. There's a distinct possibility that actually did happen. Day 240 was not useless villager wrangling time. I trapped a bunch of villagers and made sure that they could actually accept workstations before even thinking of bringing them back home. I then took a shameful amount of time to trap each of these villagers in a minecart and then hook them all together to make a fun road trip back home. I had a bit of trouble getting a furnace minecart set up at the start, so I pushed for about half the trip and then got lazy, fixed the furnace minecart issue, and hopped in the back cart for the rest of the ride home. I finished off the day by digging a pit in the ground and sent all the villagers into it. Somehow, one managed to outwit me and escape, but they were too stupid to actually fully escape and immediately trapped themselves in the pen with the sheep right after. I spent all of day 241 placing and breaking the lectern to get the mending trade. This is quite possibly one of my most hated vanilla Minecraft mechanics, but it had to be done, and thankfully, at the end of the day, I managed to get a mending trade and retain at least most of my mental sanity. Now that I had the mending enchant, I got some sticks to trade for emeralds, since apparently I didn't even have enough for one mending book. I had to do a few cycles of trades with the Fletchers before I had 38 emeralds to trade for one mending book, but eventually I had the exact amount I needed to get a single mending book from the librarian. I took the elevator back down to the base, enchanted my pickaxe with mending, and used my experience nuggets to fully repair it. Day 243 marked the start of yet another project, which meant I needed more space in the cave to set it up. I cleaned up the mess of water and vegetation that was all over the ground, and then started carving out another hole in the wall to build in. I'm not sure why, but I really like the aesthetic of building like this, with the wall overhanging the build. With a big project in mind, day 245 and 246 were going to be crafting days. I used the mechanical crafters to make 8 furnace engines and 8 flywheels, which absolutely destroyed my brass supply and took ages because of how slow my initial mechanical crafter setup was. On day 247, I took all the stuff I crafted over to the new cleared out area and started mapping out where I wanted each furnace engine set up to go. And I placed down all the blast furnaces first, followed by all the furnace engines, which attached at the side of the blast furnace, and then finally the flywheels, which go one block over from the furnace engine and then connect to that. I then placed down a chute over each of the blast furnaces and switched them to the glass variant using the wrench because, well, it just looks cooler. Once I had all those set, I placed down the encased fans over top of the chutes and put a line of cogwheels over top of each one of those to connect them all together. To finish the build off, I put down some gearboxes and shafts to connect the flywheel power output to the line of cogwheels at the top of the build. With the main bulk of the setup complete, I started out day 248 by running a belt in front of all the blast furnaces and then put down an andesite tunnel pushing items off the belt into each one. And with that, the setup was actually up and running. I wanted to make the new power generation area look a little bit nicer, but was low on moss, so I used day 249 to go on an adventure to nearby lush caves and pretty much just tear into them with my diamond hoe for moss blocks. It definitely wasn't pretty, but man, was it fun. Lucky for me, I've already lit up a lot of the lush caves nearby from mining, so I was able to just kind of run through without having to worry about any mobs and wreak havoc on their perfectly green moss blocks. I managed to make it back at the end of the day with about 5 stacks of moss blocks and a still mostly intact hoe. Now that I had more moss to work with, I spent day 250 decorating the new area. I cleared out small areas in both the floor and the ceiling to place some moss blocks in, just to break up the cobbled deep slate, and then went around placing tons of deep slate slabs down to make the terrain look a little bit more natural and a little bit more gradual. I placed down some moss carpet and glowberries for the last bit of detail. On day 251, I had to start solving the problem of lacking dried kelp blocks. The kelp farm was sufficient for passive generation early on, but since it would now be fueling my massive power generator, I had to kind of speed it up. I spent the entire day crafting everything I would need to expand on the kelp farm, which mainly included a bunch of radial chassis and mechanical harvesters. Day 252 to 255 were a little bit messy. I started out by building the kelp farm up to the ceiling with the goal of adding in multiple new layers that would just be duplicates of the first already functioning layer. Once I had finished completely building the new layers up to the ceiling, I realized I'd made my first mistake. I needed the second layer of blocks in each floor to contain water for the kelp to grow into, which would be really painful to fill in if the layer below it wasn't actually solid blocks when I went to do that. On top of that, I needed the contraption to be spinning to be able to fill it in with water in the areas where the mechanical arms were sitting. So I went down and reconnected the rotational power from the vertical windmill. Unfortunately, this very clearly caused a problem since I forgot to switch the radius of the sticky radial chassis, and now I had a partially spinning tower. I ended up disconnecting the power again, fixed the settings on the radial chassis, and then redid the water and kelp in each floor, which took forever to do. And that, my friends, is the story of how I took 4 days to add a few layers to a basic kelp farm. With the new layers added onto the kelp farm, it looked a bit out of place, so I spent day 256 adding in deep slate and deep slate tiles around the bottom to blend it in better with the ground. I also cleaned up some floating blocks around the top layer and also used deep slate and moss to blend it in more gradually with the ceiling. In the end, I was pretty happy with how it looked, even though it slightly obstructed my pretty wide open view I was used to having. Day 257 to 259 were yet again spent crafting because now that I had proper rotational power, it was time to put it to good use in the biggest build I had ever made in this world. So on day 260, I cleared out the area directly in front of the furnace engine setup. I specifically made the power generation to run the behemoth I was about to build at full speed, so keeping it nearby would make my life a lot easier when it came to actually transferring that rotational power. Once all the shrubbery and water was cleared away and the entire area was flattened out with cobbled deep slate and moss blocks, it was ready for building. Day 261 marked the first day of many that I would be building the massive gold generator. I actually started out by working backwards and initially cleared out a space for the belt to go in that would carry the gold nuggets into the basin that would make them into ingots. I put down the basin along with the mechanical press that would smash the nuggets into ingots before they would be output into a chest for storage. Since the step to make nuggets is washing red sand, I put down 5 depots next to the belt that the sand would be washed on and put smart chutes under them to filter out and destroy any dead bushes that came from the washing. I put brass funnels on the front of the depots and set them to eject on the belt, and then finished off this portion of the setup by placing down 2 encased fans that would blow water across the depots to do the actual washing. The next day, I placed down 5 millstones back and up 1 block from the depots, as these would be used to crush terracotta down into the red sand that would then be washed into gold nuggets. Initially, I used hoppers to output from the millstones to the depot, but would eventually change this later. I then placed down more depots back and up 1 block from the millstones, and placed brass funnels on the front of those to eject items into the millstones. These are where the clay would be smelted down into terracotta and then ejected into the millstones. I placed down 2 encased fans that would blow the lava across the depots to cook the clay, and put down 5 basins back and up 1 block from the depots with mechanical presses over them to actually make the clay blocks that would then be ejected onto the depots to be smelted. Do you guys think this is getting complicated enough yet, or we still want to do more? On day 263, I started out by placing 5 smart chutes behind each of the basin, and then put brass funnels pushing items into each basin. I built out a small platform and lined it with encased fans, as this is where the sand would be dumped and washed as fast as possible. I placed down all 20 crushing wheels in 2 rows of 10 above the sand washing area. Eventually, I would have cobblestone fed into the top row, which would crush it down into gravel and put it into the second row, which would then crush that down into sand and dump it in the fan path. I finished off the day by setting some of the smart chute filters and switching out the hoppers for more brass funnels on the front of the millstones. Day 264 was, it was a pretty odd day. I needed to make more electron tubes, which needed sandpaper. I was running low on paper and figured this would be a perfect time to just enchant my sandpaper to make it last way longer, since yes, you can enchant both sandpaper and superglue. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough XP to even get a mediocre enchant, so after pressing a piece of paper and crafting my sandpaper, I set out on an extremely sad adventure to try to get XP from the slow mob farm, and eventually from mining after giving up on the horrible rate mob farm. Apparently, past Rage forgot about the best XP that he could get, which would come from trading sticks with the villagers on the surface. What an idiot that guy is. At the end of the day, I processed all the ore I had mined, ate the experience nuggets, and managed to get the super lame and possibly not even worth it enchant of Unbreaking 2 on my sandpaper. The next 4 days were mainly spent doing the unfortunate task of connecting the rotational power to the entire setup from the furnace engine setup. While this isn't usually super problematic, this setup had so many encased fans that required a specific direction of rotation, so it took me ages to get everything properly spinning in the correct direction to blow the water and lava across all the blocks that needed to either be washed or smelted down. Day 269 was trial run day. It was time to see if the setup actually worked as expected, so I grabbed a bunch of sand from the storage room and chucked stacks and stacks of it into the water stream directly below the crushing wheels. I didn't have cobble generation working yet, so this would just have to do for now. I immediately noticed an issue where the encased fans, although equal on each side, still blew items into the middle basin, which would eventually cause a huge backup. I ended up deciding to just remove both sets of encased fans from the sides and only leave the ones on the back, as they would still be sufficient to bulk wash all the sand anyway, but then I had to spend the rest of day 269 and all of day 270 reconnecting the rotational power I just spent multiple days on, since the entire rotational power hub of the setup had now changed. By the end of day 270, I had it all working again and managed to set the final filters, place down the lava, and put a brass funnel on the basin so my nuggets actually got pressed instead of just bypassing and going into the chest. With the main portion of the gold generator ready to go, I needed to finish the cobblestone generator that would feed into it. So I started out day 271 by crafting even more mechanical drills, along with some brass tunnels that I would use to split the cobblestone output evenly to each set of crushing wheels. Once I had the main blocks ready to go, I went and built up over the crushing wheels of the gold generator and placed down chutes that would dump the cobblestone down directly between the wheels. I then ran a short set of belts behind them with brass funnels to input up to a stack of cobblestone into the chute at a time. Finally, I put down a line of brass tunnels and set them to forced round robin, so any cobblestone that entered would be split evenly. The next 3 days were spent building the actual cobblestone generator that would have a main belt feeding into that brass tunnel. It took me a few iterations to actually get the lanes properly spaced out, as I wanted to have 4 lanes all converging to one main belt, and I only wanted to use one stream of lava per 2 lanes to be a bit more efficient. After building it once, seeing it wasn't going to work, and then building it again, I finally had the general layout ready to go. At the end of day 274, I placed down all the mechanical drills, rotated them to face down, and connected them using cogwheels since the direction of rotation thankfully didn't matter at all here. On day 275, I filled in the water portion of the cobblestone generator and then took a quick trip down into the mine to grab 4 buckets of lava that I would need to fill in the 2 streams of lava to actually generate the cobblestone. I also crafted up another rotation speed controller, which required me to make a precision mechanism, and that took a little bit longer than I would have liked. I guess I should have tossed some extra gold plates in there before so I had plenty sitting waiting for me when I needed them. I placed the lava down and had to move it around a few times to make sure every piece of cobblestone was generating, and then I covered it all in glass just to prevent any possible accidents. We definitely don't want any OSHA violations going on in this cave. I used day 276 to connect the rotational power from the gold generator to the cobblestone generator portion of the build, and used the rotation speed controller to lower the RPM from 256 to 80. If you've used Create, you might be familiar with the fact that if you go over 80 here, your drills are going to start kicking a bunch of cobblestone out the sides and wasting it, so it's really not all that worth it. Unfortunately, this overstressed the system since not every furnace engine was running, and that was a mess of trouble. Upon checking the furnace engine setup, majority of my ore had been cooked down since the fans failed after I overstressed the system. So I spent the rest of the day manually resetting it and reconnecting the rotational power to test out the system as a whole. After sitting for a bit longer than I'd like to admit, I realized something was wrong and checked the system to find out I didn't actually hook up the first set of belts to power, so I used day 277 to connect them to the rest of the system. Once the belts were working, one problem was solved and another was created as the cobblestone was entering the tunnel one at a time, and the tunnel was going so slow compared to the belts that it was actually backing up the system heavily. To solve this, I put down a chest to collect all the cobblestone from the belt and output it in stacks of 16 to keep a constant but manageable stream of cobblestone going into the tunnel to be distributed amongst the crushing wheels. This solution worked flawlessly and the system was up and running. With the setup completely done and running, I spent the next 3 days terraforming the area around both the floating cobblestone generator and the other side of the gold generator so it blended in nicely with the base. It took stacks and stacks and stacks of deep slate to fill in the entire area and even slightly blended in with the cave around it, but in the end I think it actually looked really cool. I now had an extremely potent gold generator built right into the cave that I was living in, and it doesn't get much better than that. On day 281, I had another problem to solve. Big surprise, I know. As I had just seen, the kelp farm still wasn't enough to power the furnace engines, so I actually planned on switching over to the charcoal from the overflowing tree farm instead. I grabbed some encased fans and made a trip down into the mine again to grab some more lava that I would use to bulk smelt down the logs into charcoal. Blocks in hand, I headed over to the failing power plant and cleared out an area for some encased fans with space in front for lava and then iron bars in front of that to prevent it from just spilling everywhere. Once I had the layout ready, I extended the belt system in front of the fans so the logs would eventually be smelted there. The next day, I spent a very long time trying to figure out how to lay out the belts to loop the logs back so that they would spend 2 times as long in the fan path. Eventually, I gave up and decided to use a buffer chest so that it would only accept charcoal through a brass funnel, thus acting like a check that the logs had sufficient time to smelt down, and then it would just output the charcoal onto a belt directly in front that would carry the charcoal back to the main belt line. I spent some time hooking up all the rotational power to get the belts running in the correct direction, and finished off the day by moving the encased fans down 1 block, since they now only needed to blow on the first belt and could do that from the same level. This prevented the need for iron bars, and I wouldn't be in danger of just accidentally walking into the fan path anymore and getting burned. I spent day 283 changing the filters in the storage room so all the overflow logs went to the power generator rather than all the dried kelp blocks. I had to switch out the brass tunnel filter too and ended up having to manually remove some of the logs that made it to the blast furnaces before I actually had the charcoal filter set on the buffer chest. I replaced the andesite output funnel with a brass output funnel since it could output up to a stack at a time, and then verified that each blast furnace was filling up properly. On day 284, I started out by manually dumping a fair bit of logs onto the belt to be smelted down into charcoal since I had way too many sitting in my chests, and figured it'd probably be a good idea to jumpstart the system and get all the blast furnaces full. With all of them running and a backlog of charcoal filling up the belt, I reconnected the rotational power to the gold generator and then made a quick trip over to the tree farm. I disconnected the tree farm from the rotational power so I could edit it, and I switched the outer deployer filter from oak saplings to spruce saplings instead. You all pointed out to me that if I just made sure not all the saplings were spruce, the large trees wouldn't attempt to grow, and I figured just a few spruce trees would be enough for the minimal amount I built with, so I started the tree farm back up and updated the filters on the output funnels so that the system didn't get stalled out. Now that I had an overabundance of gold coming in, I wanted to put it to good use and make a beacon. So days 285 to 291 were spent farming wither skeleton skulls in the nether. I went back to the same nether fortress I got the blaze in for the blaze burner, and it turned out it was actually pretty big, which made finding wither skeletons a lot easier. On top of having a large fortress, I put the minimap to good use to see when they spawned and where. Even with looting 3 on my sword, it took ages for me to get the 3 skulls I needed, but I was way too lazy to go and make a farm at this point. I don't typically make many beacons, so I'm not sure if I just got really unlucky with looting 3 drops, or if this is pretty typical, but either way, by the end of day 291, I had all the skulls I needed along with an overabundance of bones, coal, and blaze rods, and I made my way back to the base. Day 292 was prep day. I haven't fought a wither in ages and built it up in my head, so in an attempt not to die, I may have overprepared just a little bit. I finally got around to enchanting my second diamond helmet I made with Protection 3, and then combined it with the other diamond helmet to make a Protection 4, Unbreaking 3, Respiration 3 diamond helmet that I then upgraded to netherite. With that, all my armor was set to go, so I went and enchanted a bow with a pretty mediocre enchant, mainly just because I was lazy and would really only ever use it during the first half of this specific wither fight. Lastly, I brewed some strength 2 potions and crafted some arrows since I didn't have infinity on my rinky-dink bow at this point. I finished off the day by planting some melon seeds and bone mealing them in hopes I could make some splash potions of healing in case something somehow went terribly wrong. I cringed so hard thinking about day 293 because I quite literally spent the entire day waiting for the melons to grow, and not a single one did. I figured with the seed fully grown, it wouldn't take super long, but apparently it does. After spending the entire day waiting and having nothing grow, I figured I somehow did something wrong and just gave up. If I somehow died with nearly perfect netherite gear, I deserve to end this series anyway. Day 294 was wither fighting day. I took a trip down to the mine and walked to an area where I didn't really see much lava on the minimap before making my tunnel for the wither fight. I cleared out a small area, placed down the soul sand and 2 skulls, and then chugged a strength 2 potion before slapping down the 3rd head and booking it backwards in the tunnel. The fight ended up being super boring as the wither really struggled with the deep slate and didn't hit any lava pockets, which is what I was really afraid of. I finished the second phase easily with my enchanted netherite sword and snagged my nether star. Clearly, I had built up the fight to be a little bit too much in my head, and I guess that's what happens when you haven't actually fought a wither in years and never play hardcore Minecraft. I spent day 295 planning out where I wanted the beacon to go, and once I was set on its position, I started towering up to make an opening to the sky. Unfortunately, I yet again ran into a massive pocket of water inside a cave when I was tunneling up to the surface, so I took a bit of time to close off the area and get rid of all the water. The respiration helmet definitely made working underwater much more tolerable, so thank God for that. Once I made it to the surface, I popped my head out to see where I was and quickly slapped some glass down before heading back down. I put down another piece of glass at the ceiling of the cave, and then the area was ready for a beacon. On day 296, I ran around the base collecting all the gold and iron I could get my hands on. I crafted it all down into blocks, hoping I would be able to fill out a full beacon if I used both. I wasn't really thrilled with the idea of using both gold and iron since it wouldn't really look great, but eventually I could replace the iron once my gold generator had a bit more time to run. I managed to finish the entire beacon with just a few blocks of iron and gold left to spare, and took way too long to realize that I had to actually put something in the beacon to be able to set the effects. Clearly it shows that I haven't made a beacon in ages. I ended up picking haste 2, and the deep slate around me was quaking in its boots. With the beacon set up, I spent the next day terraforming the area around it so it blended in a little bit better with the flooring. Obviously, it was going to stick out like a sore thumb either way, but I used some cobbled deep slate and slabs along with some moss to kind of level out the area around it, and eventually felt like it looked at least semi-acceptable just sitting in the center of the cave. On day 298, I really didn't have much time left for a big project, so I figured I'd prep for the next one by making a faster setup for the mechanical mixer and a press. I crafted up a few mixers, a press, some basin, and a depot, and placed them down next to the gold generator. I ran the 256 RPM power from the gold generator down to the mixers and press, since my goal was to have them produce andesite alloy and whatever plates I needed as fast as possible. I placed down a chest and belt in front of them, which would collect the final item outputs, and then ran a belt behind them that would be for item input. I placed down a weighted ejector at the far end of the item input to shoot items back to the chest and sort of indefinitely loop them until they were crafted, so I could mass load andesite and iron nuggets into the chest and not really have to sit and wait there and monitor it. I hooked everything up to the rotational power and figured it would be good to go, but in the end, the input belt kept randomly breaking, and after trying numerous things such as reducing the rotational speed and removing the weighted ejector, I gave up and figured it was a problem for future Rage. And with that, it was day 300 and time to bring the next chapter of the Create Hobo Living in a Cave series to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Be sure to let me know in the comments if you want to see 400 days in this same world. And also, be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, as these videos take me ages to make and it would really help me out a lot.